the National Critics' Choice Online News. I'm Robin Stienberg. Welcome to my show again. Today we're going to have a great updates pertaining to the Middle East issues happening right now in Syria and Lebanon. Here I have Dr. Peter Sluglet, who is going to talk to us about the issues that's pertaining to Lebanon and Syria. And he happens to be the visiting research professor at the Middle East Institute here in Singapore. Dr. Peter, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much.
And it's been, a very trying times that all of us are living in, especially in the case of Middle East. And could you give us some highlights into what's happening in Syria, first of all?
Well, as you know, in many countries in the Middle East, over the last 18 plus months, there have been a series of uprisings against the status quo, shall we say, to generalize as far as possible. And in Tunisia and in Egypt, this succeeded last year fairly quickly, after a couple of weeks or a month, in removing the regimes. And although it's too early to say whether these are revolutionary changes, at least we do not have the same regimes now as we did then. And on the whole, in Syria and Egypt, in Tunisia and Egypt, the regimes were replaced with, I would say, relatively little violence. Not no violence, not no casualties, not no deaths, but these were relatively, and I emphasize relatively, peaceful affairs. Last summer and early autumn, you had the same sort of thing in Libya and subsequently in Yemen. Again, in Libya, the regime was removed very violently. The head of state was killed, and this was replaced by a transitional council. In Yemen, you had a much longer sort of rumbling process, but eventually the sort of long-time 30-year president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was removed. At round about the same time that all this started, in the spring of 2011, February, March, you had similar demonstrations against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Now, Assad came to power in 2000 after the death of his father. And his father, Hafez al-Assad, had ruled Syria since 1970. So you have a succession of father to son, and in other words, the dictatorship has been handed down through the generations. Now, I should say very quickly that Bashar was not his father's first choice. There was an older brother who'd been groomed for the succession, but the older brother was killed in a car crash sometime in the early 1990s. So Bashar, who had done medicine in Damascus University and had been sent to London for further training as an ophthalmologist, was brought home, and it was understood that he would succeed his father when the time came. And if I can just add, of course, this was what Saddam Hussein had done, although both his sons were sort of utter psychopaths, and one really wonders what sort of job they would have made of being president of Iraq. But anyway, for the first few years, there was hope, certainly when Hafez al-Assad died in 2000, that there would be reform, change, and so forth. And to a certain extent, there was a certain amount of economic liberalization, but frankly, there was too little political liberalization to make any significant difference. And so as it were, seeing, I think, the sort of, there was the sort of domino or copycat effect of the Arab Spring. And so you had these risings in these demonstrations and crowds calling for change initially in small towns in southern and northern Syria, which were these were peaceful demonstrations for change, and these were greeted with a violent response where troops fired on peaceful demonstrators and so on. And essentially this has been the story ever since February-March 2011. But the difference being, the difference from let's say Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, is that essentially the army has rallied very much around the regime, and so what you have with defections from the army, with people who are interested in overthrowing Bashar al-Assad from the outside, supplying defectors from the army with weapons and so forth. So what you have in Syria is a civil war.
Now, speaking about the civil war, you spoke about the political differences that has embarked for Syria among different parties. What kind of strategies do you think right now the Syrian government and as well as the opposition are now grappling with? Do you foresee there's going to be new policies imposed for new reforms, or will there be new regimes that will still conform to the old former Syria?
Well, it's of course very difficult to predict what will happen, but I think sadly the only way in which this is going to solve itself is for Assad to step down in some way or another. He could either step down because he was sort of overthrown, like Ceausescu in Romania, or he could step down after briefly heading some sort of transition, which would be, I think, a bit unlikely to expect from somebody who's shown a fair degree of intransigence so far. So, it's not really possible, it seems to me, to envisage a future Syria with Assad still in charge when his regime has been responsible for the death of 25,000 plus people. The regime certainly loses its legitimacy in this way. And I do stress that at the beginning, this was seen as a series of peaceful protests which were met by violence, demonstrations broken up, and so on and so on and so forth. And the other thing to remember in this situation is that when we say a civil war, we think of the A's against the B's struggling for control of the state. This is a relatively small group of armed insurrectionists, oppositionists, who are struggling to topple the regime. Now, but the regime has tanks, the regime has airplanes, the regime has helicopter gunships, and of course the opposition has none of these things. So it's an extremely unequal contest.
Now, how far do you think the Syrian government is going to quench the revolution?
Well, it's doing its best, but as I said, the rebels are supplied with from, unfortunately, those beacons of democracy, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and both of whom have every interest in removing the Syrian regime because of its ties with Iran. And so, to some extent, although it is an unequal contest, the rebels, as it were, are more inspired, have more, in other words, the regime is simply defending the status quo. The rebels wish to overthrow the regime and replace it with something else. Unfortunately, we don't know what this something else might be. And the fact is that the opposition is quite divided, and there's divided internally, and also the sort of thing we saw in Iraq, where you have the opposition political leadership from outside and the opposition political leadership from inside, and they're not particularly well coordinated. I mean, the sort of thing you see on the BBC is, what is the address of the Syrian opposition? And this is a very serious problem. I mean, obviously, one can't say they should organize themselves better or something like that. I mean, the fact is that in such situations, we all know what we don't want, but it's much more difficult to work out a sort of coherent strategy of what we will do on the day after.
Now, who are the puppet master? Who is the puppet master in charge right now in Syria, and who are the key actors behind the puppet master?
Well, I wouldn't put it quite like that. I mean, in the sense, it seems to me you have the regime, which is led by Assad and his family. I mean, his in-laws, his cousins, and so on, who have dominated, the economy, and also with generals in the army, most of whom were friends or long-time associates of his father, although obviously these people, given that his father came to power at the age of about 40 in 1970, obviously these people will themselves sort of die out, but their children and people who are still loyal to the regime. If you look at photographs of Syrian politicians, you see they're all quite elderly, or many of them are quite elderly. And you have, for example, this major defection of this Brigadier General Klaas. Well, Klaas was Hafez al-Assad's long-time defense minister. So you can see that there is a certain sort of continuity among the elite. But the problem is it's extremely difficult to see who is in charge of what, and we are not privy to what the regime itself is doing. The opposition is really very fragmented and very localized. I mean, in the sense that there is this Free Syrian Army, but the Free Syrian Army in, let's say, Aleppo, and the Free Syrian Army in Damascus are presumably communicating with each other, but really from the outside. And and of course there's extremely difficult for journalists to get in, and a couple of senior journalists have been killed, so you can imagine the incentive to have a look at it is probably rather limited. It's very, very difficult to see what's going on.
Now, what kind of policies does the UN view Syria's circumstances right now? And how is the US and NATO going to react to this? Do they have any plans that you could perceive that they would want to take military action or diplomatic action?
Well, I think basically the problem, if you like, I mean, certainly the problem as presented to us, in the newspapers and in the media, is that the Russians and the Chinese are backing Assad. And this is true to a certain. This is true. On the other hand, in a certain sense, there's little doubt to me that the Americans are not entirely unhappy about this situation, whatever they may say, because the Americans have sort of more or less evacuated Iraq. They are going to evacuate Afghanistan. The United States is still emerging very, very slowly from a major economic crisis, and really I do not think that they would wish to get themselves involved on the ground or in the air in Syria. I can imagine that it might be possible for the United States to enforce with NATO some sort of no-fly zone, which would simply mean that no Syrian army or armed forces aeroplanes, helicopters, bombers, and so forth could take off. More than that, it's really very difficult to see what they should do. I mean, it's I think even the Syrian opposition would be hard pressed. The Syrian opposition would say to the Russians, "Stop supporting and arming Assad." But what they would like done beyond that, I don't think they have seriously given any thought to, because. What are we talking about? That that American airplanes should bomb the presidential palace, or what exactly? I mean, nobody has really thought this through, and it's also. So in other words, to go back to the point I made before, it's not entirely. The Americans are not entirely unhappy about the situation where they can pretend to be upset not to be doing anything. I mean, in many ways, although that sounds very callous, it's not as sort of straightforwardly dreadful as it seems, because even if you could wave a wand, it's quite difficult to see what the United States best policy in this situation would be.
Now, speaking about maneuvering some policies, what do the Chinese and the Russians stand to gain when they for supporting Syria?
Well, I mean, partly because there is a sort of knee-jerk reaction. I mean, more for the Russians than the Chinese, but also from the Chinese, that the Americans should not get away with everything. In other words, they have seen. Essentially, the Americans overthrew Gaddafi. And also, they have seen that these regimes coming to power in Tunisia and Egypt, although they will not enjoy the same cordial relationship with the United States that the regimes of Ben Ali and Mubarak did, they are not going to be hostile to the United States either in the long term. I think that seems fairly clear. Because, in order to do this, you would have to have a real revolution, which meant sort of taking over the state. In other words, renationalizing everything, which is certainly not going to happen. And so, and I suspect that the future rulers of Libya are not going to do anything that offends the United States either. The real problem the real problem in this region is that Syria and Iran are the only countries who do not automatically do what the United States wants. And so the Russians and the Chinese are quite content to maintain that situation, so that the United States shall not have its way all over the world.
Now, what steps do you see right now in your observation for the next 6 months or so with the situation in Syria? Do you think, in your perception, the Syrian government is going to take steps to resolve peace with the rebels anytime soon?
No. The Syrian government, as I said before, the Syrian government is so discredited. Essentially, it's like this. I mean, obviously you have a minority of people taking arms in the street against the regime, but most people, I would say a majority, if not perhaps 2/3 of the population of Syria would be quite happy if this regime went. So the other third are people who fear either those who are bound up with the regime itself in some way, either economically or financially, or who work for the regime in some fashion. But in general, there are people who fear that, rightly or wrongly, and I do not know whether these fears are justified, that some kind of militant Islamists will come to power and wreak terrible vengeance upon the various minorities. and the minorities are about between 25 and 30% of the population. Because the Sunni Muslims, who are the majority, are maybe somewhere between 70-75%.
Now we're going to take a break right now here at the National Goodness Choice with Dr. Peter Sluglet, and we will continue right after this part 2 on the issue of Lebanon.